Hey guys, I just wanted to give you a little introductory lecture on Edgar Huntley, subtitled Memoirs of a Sleepwalker. I think that this text is a difficult read if you come at it with no context. That's not to say that it's not worthwhile coming at the text with no context, because I think that there are really interesting ways that you could read this book outside of who the author was or what was going on historically at the time. And we're going to talk about that in kind of at the end of this unit. But I think that for our purposes in this kind of being just an introductory American Lit course, we really need context, I think, for you all to at least accept the fact that you have to read this. So I want to talk a little bit about who the author is, Charles Brockden Brown, and then just a couple of things to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you are reading Edgar Huntley. So first of all, Charles Brockden Brown, this is a little thing I grabbed from Wikipedia, so hopefully that's the correct image of him. But he was born in Pennsylvania to a Quaker family in 1771. Now, I think I covered this a little bit later on, but Edgar Huntley was published in 1799 or written in 1799, so just right at the turn of that century. Brown studied law before he became a novelist or writer and intellectual, and he kind of hung out with other intellectuals of his time, and that's a thing that we're going to see a lot in American Lit, is these authors who are hanging out with each other and having ideas and kind of just in these literary or intellectual circles, and he did that as well. And when I was in college, I read Edgar Huntley in 2 classes, actually, with the same instructor. I just kept taking this class and we kept reading this book, and I loved it. And one of the things that my instructor said to me was that a lot of the times Edgar Allan Poe is considered the father of the American Gothic, and that we can consider Charles Brockden Brown the grandfather of American Gothic. And the text that I am reading, and I have a PDF copy for you guys just so that you didn't have to purchase the book, but I am reading the Penguin Classics version, and in it there's an introduction, and it kind of explains that Brown saw so much potential in the American landscape, especially at the time, with the issues with the 1771, so new America, but also the issues that had been playing out with Native Americans, and he saw so much potential for sort of this very Gothic style, violent, gory, but taking place in the home and then a little bit outside of the home, society, what you would consider civilized society, or what they considered civilized society, compared to sort of the wildness of the land. And he saw a lot of potential for that in writing and in kind of dealing with the psyche and things like that. And so you'll see that in Edgar Huntley, and I think that that's partly the reason why it can be challenging to read, because it's strange, it's weird, and you have to, I think, give yourself over to the weirdness, and Brown is doing this on purpose. So I think that that's interesting too, while we read, to kind of think about it is weird, it is hard to follow, but is that a reflection of the concept of the book in itself? Brown's writing style, I think, is a little bit melodramatic. Some of the things that he writes are dramatic, but almost, and I think this is why it's been compared to a lot of women's space novels, because he writes in sort of this very thinking kind of way. The narrator gives you all of the ideas that are in the narrator's mind. I mean, we don't get very much dialogue, if really any at all. I mean, there's some dialogue and conversation in Edgar Huntley, but it's a lot of like the musings of the narrator. And we're gonna see that in masculine texts, but we do see that a lot also in more feminine texts. So it has been characterized as a little bit of a melodrama, although I don't think it's melodrama in terms of what we really think of like with our melodrama movies and TV shows in our like contemporary pop culture. He situates everyday characters in politically stressful situations in order to provide educational commentary on history and current events of his time. And so what I mean is like he takes your run-of-the-mill or what Brown would consider run-of-the-mill characters, men and women, particularly young men and women, and he puts them in strange situations. Okay, so like in Edgar Huntley, we have a really strange situation of like this sleepwalking man following another sleepwalking man who's stressed out because of the things that he has done, and almost stressed out because of them in a weird way. And then we get into, you know, like as they follow each other in the spaces that they go to in the wilderness, and then Native Americans that they run into, and just kind of like these very like high anxiety situations. I mean, if you aren't already anxious, by the time you start reading the book, you'll probably feel anxious while and maybe after you read it as well. So he does this on purpose because he is trying to provide commentary on the events of his time and even on history. You know, at the time that Edgar Huntley is written, a lot of, it's not like white settlers and Native Americans, they're not new to conflict. Conflict has been happening between two groups for a while, and so he is kind of providing commentary on what's happened in the recent history as well. I say down here, like, grab a dictionary. Charles Brockden Brown likes complicated sentences and big words. But I also want to tell you, like, push through them. There's plenty of words that Brown uses, and in context, I understand them. Out of context, they probably don't. They're not really in my vocabulary. And I think that, you know, most of the time I just push through them. I don't look up what the words mean unless I have no concept of what the sentence is even saying, and then I'll look up the words and like try to make sense of it. But he has a very big vocabulary and a slightly antiquated vocabulary, you know, words that we don't really use, although it's not really considered Old English. We couldn't even read it if it was Old English, but, you know, it's older than our English is today, and a more formal jargon as well. So if you know, have Siri on hand and just ask her or him, like, what is the meaning of this word, and try to read it, or just try to push through. I think that his writing is plain enough to where you can understand what is going on, even if you don't understand like exactly that sentence, if that makes sense. Okay, so some things that you're going to see, and like I mentioned before, I am reading the Penguin's Classic version of this novel, and there is an introduction by, I cannot remember this man's first name, but last name is Graybo, and so I have pulled a lot of this information from his introduction, and if anybody wants me to like share that with them, please let me know, because I think I can probably do that, although I probably shouldn't say that on here. But some common like themes, motifs, things that you're going to see in any of Brown's novels, and we're just reading one, is that all of his writing seems to depend on some kind of strangeness or abnormality that puts the character to the test. So what weird thing is going on that's testing the character of the character's character? In Edgar Huntley, it's the death of his friend, investigating the death of his friend, finding someone who seems to be way more stressed out than he is, but also this strange like twin symbolism in that he becomes a sleepwalker just like the sleepwalker that he is following, you know, or has he been a sleepwalker this whole time? Like we get, and we'll talk about an unreliable narrator in just a second, but this weirdness that tests the character's character. And that's either something that's going on internally or externally, or possibly both, honestly. I think we're seeing both in Edgar Huntley. The editor who wrote the introduction to the novel, or to the version that I'm reading, wrote that a lot of Brown's novels are morally instructive, and I think that that means just they tell you how you should act. He says they could even be like didactic, so much as not only to just suggest, but to be super direct in saying, this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do. And we are going to see that in Edgar Huntley. In the first 10 chapters already, we see Brown take to these like rhetorical questions. And these rhetorical questions seem to suggest Brown's almost like interjection on, you know, well, what should we do in this situation? What should anyone do in this situation? You know, there's a point in the text where kind of like sometime between chapters 8 and 9, where our sort of secondary main character, Clitheroe, he has finished telling his tale, and Edgar Huntley is like, you know, I think I understand why you did what you did. And then we kind of leave the perspective of Edgar Huntley, and I think that we get into this Brown's head a little bit more, and that's where we get this moral instruction of these rhetorical questions that offer, you know, a suggestion of the right answer, and then at times he even is like, it's okay, yes, it is okay to do this, or it's not okay to do this. Most of his characters are like 18 to 20 something year olds on the brink of maturity. Edgar Huntley is, I don't know, how old do we picture him? I picture him as like 18, maybe 19. I mean, he's old enough to have his independence. And I mean, also we're talking about like the 1700s, right? 18 and 19 might actually be too old. But he's old enough to have his independence, and yet he's not married, although he was engaged, and he's still kind of like in his... some scholars would argue that he is still in his like playboy phase, I guess. Although we don't really see that in the narrative unless we're reading really far into it. We will see unreliable narrators in Brown's novels, and in Edgar Huntley we get multiple narrators because sometimes the perspective switches, especially when Clitheroe is telling his story and then Edgar goes back to kind of explaining how he came to hear Clitheroe's story. We get these two narrators and we're not exactly sure if we should believe them or not. The whole point of Edgar Huntley is an epistolary novel. It's a letter. It's a letter to Mary Waldegrave, who is Huntley's betrothed. And, well, at some point he breaks up with her, but you'll read that in the first part. So we get these unreliable narrators, and also we have to think about like what's the point of them, but more to come in just a few minutes on that. We also get the uncanny of twins and doubles. I'm going to talk about that in the last lecture in a lot of detail once you've got a real good sense of Edgar Huntley, but we see Edgar and Clitheroe as kind of twins for each other. We see Mrs. Lorimer and her brother, who are literal twins. We also see Mrs. Lorimer and Clarice, who look just like each other, even though they're not whatever the other twin type is that's not fraternal. Identical. Yep. They're not identical twins. They're not even siblings, but they look very similar. So we see so many twins, we see so many doubles, and if you think about that, and you think about like the confusing landscape of Brown's language, that is almost like a double for the strange literal landscape and of the novel, particularly the wilderness of the novel, because things kind of make a lot of sense when we're in a city, when we're in buildings, and then Brown's writing starts to make less sense out in the woods when the characters are out in the woods, going into caves, climbing mountains or hills, you know, thinking about chopping down trees or whatever. So we see not only humans as twins and doubles, but also language and landscape as twins and doubles. And if you are interested in thinking about that, that's definitely a cool thing to kind of like read into. Okay, what should you know before you read Edgar Huntley? So Edgar Huntley was published in 1799, right on the cusp of the turn of the century. It's an epistolary novel, so it's told through a series of letters. The first, like 27 chapters, basically the whole book, is one letter to Mary Waldegrave, and then there's 3 small letters at the end, and not all of them are from Edgar Huntley's perspective. So that's really important to think about. It's not just a novel to the reader, right? It's a letter to a character in the book. And how does that change our reading of the text when we think of it that way? It's easy to forget, but it's important to remember, I think. That means the primary audience is Mary Waldegrave, or Edgar's betrothed. He's supposed to marry her some way through the first part of our reading, and it's real hidden in there. He's like, you know what? I don't think we should be married anymore. Or not even that. I don't think we should get married anymore because of this situation that I'm in. And I think that it's so easy to forget about that, but that's such an important part of this book, especially in the way that I will suggest in the final lecture of this unit, and I'm going to give you like a precursor to that. There are common and uncommon yet very convincing readings of Edgar Huntley, and I think that the last one I'm going to talk about here is the reason I'm so fascinated with the book. First, you can read it in like a historical sense. So what are some of the social concerns of the time? And what are some of, like, you know, the historical social concerns in 1799, or really prior, in the right after America has, you know, been given its independence, or fought for, won, however you want to think of it, gotten that independence. What are those concerns? Because Huntley is basically being raised on New America, or in New America, and he's writing at the same time, you know, a lot of our political things that we read in our week 5, one of those weeks, I think it was week 5 actually. So he's kind of like been raised on that language, been raised on that political literature too. So we can think of it in a very historical context. We can also think about it as fear of the other. You know, in the reading that we're looking at for this section, we don't get too much of that fear of the other. That's going to come up later, especially once we're introduced to our Native American characters. We see a little bit of fear of the other when Clitheroe is first introduced, because he is called a foreigner. I believe that he is Irish, although I'm not exactly sure that the book tells us that per se, outright and directly. But he's, you know, accused of murder. He's an immigrant to where Huntley lives, and so, you know, maybe there's that kind of fear of the other happening there, which also could tie into your historical social concerns with people coming to America once it's now formed as a country. I think that another really, really interesting way to read the text is as Brown's critique of the male ego. Okay, so not your female teacher's critique of the male ego, but actually as Charles Brockden Brown's critique of the male ego. And there are plenty of scholars who have commented on this, and I think that it's definitely a convincing and worthwhile read, because you notice a lot of this, like thinking of the age of Edgar Huntley and noticing a lot of like egotistical statements. He has a lot of questions in here, and he has a lot of like internal monologues and thinking and really an internal dialogue, because he's almost just talking to himself. But sometimes he has these moments where he's just like so egotistical, and I think that that's on purpose. Almost anyone would read it and be like, wow, bro, are you sure? So I think that's an interesting way to approach the text as well. And then finally, my past instructor when I was a student in college, he had published academic papers on Edgar Huntley, and the way that he kind of incorporated our lectures into his, or incorporated his scholarship into kind of our lectures and what we were learning about the text was a psychoanalytic I'm not going to probably say this word right, but abortio-fascient reading. And so what that means is you may not notice without me pointing it out, but I'm going to point it out now because I think it's worth noticing. Notice how much of the language reflects pregnancy and pregnancy loss. And so if you look at this word psychoanalytical, abortio-fascient, abortion, right? That language and the language that at the time would have been associated with that, but we can also associate that with any pregnancy loss, is really interesting because there is a claim that the whole purpose of Edgar Huntley's letter to Mary Waldegrave is that he has gotten her pregnant before their marriage, and he's realized that he doesn't want to marry her, but that's not the right thing to do, right? Because she's pregnant. He has to marry her, but actually it would be best for him if she wasn't pregnant. And so the claim is that this letter is a linguistic abortion almost, in getting her to be so distraught in reading his experience that she miscarries. And so there is some claims on that as well. They're really fascinating, and I have to credit like all of this to Dr. Mark Boren because none of this is my idea, only what he ever taught us in class or suggested through his brilliance in class. So I find that really interesting, and one of the articles that you guys can have access to on ProQuest is his literature or his scholarship that he wrote, and if you find that interesting or worthwhile studying, I would take a look at that too. So if you have made it this far, I am going to give you a quick audio summary of chapters 1 through 10 in Edgar Huntley, and the reason I'm doing this is twofold. One, thanks for watching us. I hope that these lecture videos are helpful for you on your unit quizzes. I know y'all have a lot to do, but also I recognize that the text is difficult. It's not straightforward all the time, and it's not all that easy to read. I have to read it really slowly to process everything that I'm reading, and even then I don't think I'm processing everything. So I think it makes more sense if you, like, the first time I ever read this book, I was completely lost and I had no idea what was going on. But now this is like the, I don't know, third or fourth time that I've read the novel, and it makes so much more sense because I know just like the basic gist of what is happening. So a super brief summary of Edgar Huntley, here we go. And chapters 1 through 10, I will do this at the end of every video. So Edgar is distraught because his friend Waldegrave was just murdered underneath an elm tree, and he goes to that elm tree and he sees a man who's like kind of not really himself, seeming to act a little bit sporadic, and he's like, who is this guy who's at the place of my friend's murder? I wonder if this is the murderer. Who could he be? And so that starts kind of like the psychosis of Edgar Huntley, at the very least what we know to be his obsession and figuring out, who is this guy in the elm? Did he kill my friend? So Edgar follows him and learns of his identity, and his identity is Clitheroe, who is an immigrant, a servant in one of the nearby houses. Edgar basically follows Clitheroe out into the woods, watches Clitheroe disappear into a cave, and Edgar's like, I'm not going in that cave. I don't know where it leads. I'm just going to chill here. If he comes back, great. Like, maybe there's no other exit. Maybe he'll just come back this way. If not, I'll know that, you know, the cave is probably safe. Either that or he died in there. So he does not see Clitheroe exit the cave. Edgar leaves, but he's kind of like confirmed who Clitheroe is. Eventually he tracks down Clitheroe and says like, hey man, what are you doing? And Clitheroe tells him his story. And Clitheroe's story is that he is new to America. While he was on the continent or somewhere in England, but I think Ireland, he basically was adopted by a woman named Mrs. Lorimer, and to be kind of like her servant, but really to be like a friend to her son. And Clitheroe, okay, to clarify, ends up kind of being more of a confidant to Mrs. Lorimer anyway, and he and her son kind of eventually part ways. And I feel like there's more to it with the son, but I can't remember. So then, one of the things that Clitheroe tells us is that Mrs. Lorimer had a twin brother named Arthur Wyatt who was like an evil twin, basically. Mrs. Lorimer was good and kind, and Arthur Wyatt was terrible. Mrs. Lorimer was engaged to this guy, or was in love with this guy, but Arthur and her family would not let her marry him, so eventually they split up. And then at some point, Arthur Wyatt gets banished. Read the book, I can't remember why. And rumors of his death arise. But in his banishment, he has fathered a daughter. And Mrs. Lorimer takes in her brother's daughter, so her niece, and kind of like raises her as her own daughter. Clitheroe and Mrs. Lorimer's, you know, adopted daughter, basically niece, end up falling for each other. And she like gives her blessing. When Clarice, this is Mrs. Lorimer's niece, is kind of like at the bedside of her friend, Arthur Wyatt comes back and returns, and accosts Clitheroe one evening. Clitheroe does not know who it is, but in self-defense he shoots and kills him. And then, like wild, Clitheroe is so stressed out that he has killed his lady, you know, Mrs. Lorimer. And I'm saying lady not in the sense of like how we would say, oh, my old lady today, but in the sense of like lords and ladies, the woman he works for, who he essentially worships, the way that he talks about her. So he's so stressed out about the fact that Mrs. Lorimer has always said, if you ever come across my brother, just let him pass. Like, don't harm him, because any harm that comes to him will come to me. So Clitheroe's stressed out, right? He just shot her brother, and now he's worried that the same fate will happen to her. So he sneaks into her bedchamber to like check on her that night and make sure that she's alive and not like bleeding out from a gunshot wound. And he sees her, or who he thinks is her, and then he's like, oh, thank goodness she's safe. But then he sees a dagger on her bedside, oddly enough, like what's that doing there? And he picks it up and says, you know what, eventually she's going to learn about her brother's murder. She's going to learn that it was me, and she's going to be so desperately miserable, like that might do her in anyway. So he decides he might as well, it's just crazy, he might as well just go ahead and kill her now so he can put her out of her misery. So while he's getting ready to stab who he thinks is Mrs. Lorimer, someone grabs his hand, and it's Mrs. Lorimer who grabs his hand. So who is laying in the bed? Well, Clarice is almost a spitting image of Mrs. Lorimer. So he's about to stab the woman he's in love with until he gets stopped by the woman he intentionally meant to stab. And she's like, what are you doing? And so then he's like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? So then he tries to stab himself, and she's like, you can't do that. Well, he's obviously now so stressed out about this whole entire incident that he exiles himself to America. That is how Clitheroe gets to America, and that's kind of essentially the end of Clitheroe's tale. Edgar has now been told, Clitheroe told this whole thing to Edgar. So now Edgar has heard it. Right when he's done telling his tale, he just like ups and leaves, and Edgar expects to see him the next day, but he doesn't. So when Clitheroe goes missing, Edgar goes into the wilderness to find him, and essentially in chapters like 9 and 10 we get this narrative confusion of Edgar walking into a cave and kind of like his lengthy description of that cave. The argument about like pregnancy and pregnancy loss, what I was talking about before, you can read those chapters as if that cave was a womb, and I think it will make a lot more sense. But you know, he gets through the cave, he gets to the other side, he sees Clitheroe, he calls to him, Clitheroe like disappears somehow again, and Edgar, at the end of it all, this is what Edgar is thinking, or at least my interpretation. And I'm talking about like just chapters 1 through 10. This is not the whole book. Clitheroe says, or sorry, Edgar Huntley says, you know what? It's a bummer that I can't, you know, just find my way out from where I am. Because once he gets through the cave, he's at this like really super tall hill that if he tried to go down, he'd probably fall and die. And he's like, well, the only way that I can get back home is back through this cave, which is terrible, because the cave was dark and he felt like he was, you know, on the brink of death every step. But he looks at a tree next to him and he's like, you know what? If I can just knock this tree down and make a bridge, that would be a really easy way to get out. So I'm going to go home through the cave, get an axe, come back through the cave and chop this tree down so there's a real easy way to get out of this cave exit. So I just want you to think about that for a second. Like the logic of that claim is there for a reason, and I'll let you guys figure it out. But that's chapters 1 through 10. I'm sure that I've left out some really interesting details, but I wanted to give you a summary, like that's what's going on. So as you read now, you can read past just what's going on, and you can read into like, how do I interpret what's going on? Because that's really important. Okay, that is the end of this lecture. If you have questions, please email me. I love this book. I'll talk about it like constantly with you all.